Thank you very much, Rafal, for the kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to join you in the government Foresight community today. I'll just open my slides. Here we go. So I'll be sharing our experience in working with global trends analysis and futures thinking in the OECD's Directorate for Education and Skills. I'm joined today by my colleagues Tali Malkin and Jonathan James, who co-authored the latest report and who will also be joining us in the discussion after the presentation. Perhaps as a warning, I should say that personally, I'm quite new to the area of strategic foresight. I've been working on education policy analysis for almost 2 decades, but I took over this project on trend shaping education only a bit over a year ago. So still have lots to learn and want to assure you that your feedback, your insights, and your advice will be very well taken and very helpful for us in the further development of this work. So with this, while I am new, the project itself is not new at all. It has a long history at the OECD. The Trend Shaping Education Project was launched 17 years ago in 2008, is one of the most long-standing projects of our Directorate for Education and Skills. And over the years, the different project teams have built and refined the methodology. So I'm happy to share some of the lessons learned from the history of the project, as well as some of the findings of our latest edition that we published in January 2025. So very, very recently. The main goal of trend shaping education is to foster long-term strategic thinking in education. And the report is aimed at all education stakeholders, including policymakers, researchers, teacher educators, and it can also be used for futures thinking at the institutional level, as well as in the classroom among teachers and students. And the language is deliberately accessible to a broad audience. So by analyzing global trends and developing futures thinking tools, the project aims to help these stakeholders in anticipating changes by identifying opportunities and challenges, to support innovation and creativity by spurring new ideas, helping them future-proofing and stress testing existing strategies, and overall to stimulate reflection and conversation rather than giving any definite answers or policy recommendations. So it's really about raising questions and being a conversation starter in education. We have a range of different outputs. The flagship of this project is the triannual Trend Shaping Education Report series. And we also have a series of spotlight reports where we take a deep dive into specific trends and into the research on its implications for education. We also offer interactive workshops, so-called future labs, where we bring together different stakeholders within an education systems to reflect together on the future of education. And we're launching this biennium a new strand of work where we'll have a closer look into what education systems are already doing in strategic foresight themselves at the national level. And we're aiming to build a community of foresight practitioners that are working specifically in the education sector and to develop some comparative analysis of how strategic foresight is done in education, what some of the specificities are in this sector, which is so explicitly concerned with building the future and building skills and competencies for the future. So the Trend Shaping Education project and reports offer 2 main approaches to think about the future of education. Primarily, I would say they provide this overview of key economic, social, demographic, technological trends that might be relevant for education. And then secondly, the reports use emerging signals to identify potential future developments that are not yet visible in the data. And this helps readers think about what could happen if the trends break or bend or accelerate or interact in unexpected ways. The golden thread for our reports is always this focus on education. So the chapters will always conclude by reflecting on how the trends and the alternative futures may influence education, and in turn, how education could actively shape those alternative futures itself and how it can take a more active role in perhaps working towards a desired future and identifying those futures. So what are some of the characteristics of the Trend Shaping Education project? One key element is that the futures thinking is combined with a quite systematic approach to reviewing global data on megatrends. So to identify the trend data, we start by brainstorming key trends with country experts in our governing board and also internally with our colleagues in the Directorate for Education and Skills and other OECD directorates. But in parallel, we engage in a more systematic data-driven approach to identifying global trend data. And so what we do is that we go systematically through all OECD publications, working papers, official reports in all areas of public policy that the OECD publishes since the last edition of the report. So this year we went back to 2021 and systematically went through the publications to identify whether they included any trend data. And this helps us to go beyond the obvious. So the brainstorming identifies the trends that are on everybody's minds and that we should not be missing. But in this systematic scan, we often find trend data that are not so much talked about and that can offer further nuance and different perspectives on global developments. Usually this process yields quite a lot of data, so we use some criteria to narrow down the choice of indicators that are included in the report. So to be selected, the indicators need to be available for not just OECD countries, but ideally a broad range of countries internationally. They need to be available on a through time basis and long term. We aim for at least kind of a 20-year horizon in the historical trend data, and they should be coming from robust sources. We aim for about a 50% of the indicators coming from OECD data and others coming from other peer-reviewed sources. And then we reach out to subject experts to help us fact-check this data and ensure it's robust and in line with scientific standards. Across the various editions of the book, we aim for a balance between continuity and innovation. So there's some topics that are always covered, like economic development, labor markets, and demography, and that are refined and reviewed in each edition. But at the same time, the series is designed so that each edition complements the previous one. So we have a focus, for example, in 2016 on urbanization, 2019 on security, 2022 on climate change and our changing nature. Here you can see the topics that made it into the most recent 2025 edition. In this latest report, we aim to offer a narrative that moves from the more global to more personal issues. So it starts with new global perspectives on conflict and cooperation. Then it zooms into economic and social concerns in the chapter called Work and Progress. Then it explores political and cultural trends in voices and storytelling. And it concludes with the chapter more on health and well-being issues in a chapter called Bodies and Minds. In addition to the main chapters, there are some issues that are now so embedded in all aspects of our societies that they are covered in every chapter and that we use them as cross-cutting issues. And these are technology, sustainability, and equality topics. Another key characteristic of trends is the language that it uses and its presentational choices. So you can see here how the data is usually presented in the trends reports. The chapters are structured in a series of double pages, where each two-pager presents two data points that are loosely connected to a common theme. And it is by bringing the two data points into conversation that the story emerges, and often that helps us offer kind of a fresh look at the topic and building a storyline here. And then each two-pager finishes with a box that raises questions for education. And these are more speculative, illustrative questions of what the continuation of those trends might mean for education systems. The language of all this is very accessible. The idea was really to reach a broad audience, but the feedback we get from policymakers is that also for policymakers is very useful to have a presentation like that is to the point, accessible, and succinct. So overall, each edition covers about 25 2 pages like that, more or less. So obviously I won't have time to present the presentation to you. It's more designed for use in workshops and more in-depth sessions on each of the topics. But I thought I'd pick out two trends from each of the chapters just to give you a flavor of the breadth of the publication. And then after that, we'll speak a bit more about the future thinking tools that we develop for each of the chapters. So the first chapter, Global Conflict and Cooperation, covers issues including armed conflict and migration, but also global trade, energy security, climate issues, green technologies, global science cooperation. And the chapter begins by highlighting the rise in state-based armed conflict that began around 2009. And that includes state-on-state conflicts like the war in Ukraine, but also conflicts between states, and non-state actors, where at least one side is supported by a foreign government. And other indicators in this chapter then highlight the far-reaching implications of those conflicts for migration, energy security, trade dynamics, labor markets, and spending priorities. On the other hand, the chapter looks into issues of international collaboration, both at a policy level, but also in other fields. And in this graph, for example, you see a focus on rising international research collaboration and how the percentage of scientific publications involving international co-authorships has increased in recent years. And it highlights the importance of this type of collaboration in addressing and solving global challenges, including the planetary crises, and is also something, of course, that was seen in the COVID-19 pandemic, where sharing of data and research led to breakthroughs in this field. So some of the questions raised in Chapter 1 are for education around how education can foster resilience among learners and build competencies for them to contribute to a more peaceful world, how education systems can provide migrants with relevant education and training while promoting appreciation for diversity among all, and how governments can ensure research security while allowing for scientific collaboration and academic freedom to thrive. The next chapter, Work and Progress, focuses on not just on labor market issues, but also on issues of socioeconomic and gender equality, opportunities for young people, and our lifestyle choices in a world increasingly dominated by technological change and environmental crises. Of course, we could not draft this chapter without looking at the recent revolution in AI technologies. It looks here into how there's been a rise in job postings that are AI specific, and how this rise is still quite modest, but the chapter highlights how AI is also changing job requirements, skills requirements in many other, across all sectors and in many other tasks. And how the concentration of talent in AI is not yet keeping the pace of those developments. So beyond changes in the labor market, the chapter also looks at the time that we spend on working overall in our lives and how working hours have been decreasing over many years now, and especially among the young people, that people are working shorter hours, that it's less common to work long hours, and there's a greater ambition for work-life balance overall. So some of the questions raised by the chapter around how education can, at all levels, can support the skills transition to ensure that no one is left behind, how education can prepare young people for various aspects of social life, including beyond work, and how education policies can also address teachers' wish for work-life balance and ensuring greater flexibility in the work of people in the education workforce. Then we have the chapter on voices and storytelling that looks into how voices, whose voices are being heard, whose stories are being told in an increasingly globalized and digital world. And this is in the political sphere, but also in the cultural sphere, in the arts and online. So one of the data points addressed here is the decline in voter turnout in parliamentary elections since several decades now, how this trend mirrors a growing dissatisfaction with democracy. And the chapter also addresses concerns about declining press freedom, an increase in misinformation, disinformation online, the rise in polarisation, and other related topics. At the same time, it also highlights that the decline in voter turnout doesn't necessarily mean that citizens are becoming more apathetic, but that there are different forms of expressing one's views in democracies. One of them is protests. We see here a rise in global protests. The chapter also addresses increasing diversity of voices being expressed online in various formats, and both the opportunities and risks around that. Questions raised for education include how education can empower people of all ages to effectively address the issues that they care about, how learners' online activities shape their citizenship, creativity, and self-expression, and how education can equip people with the critical skills to distinguish between facts, falsehoods, and opinions in a changing information landscape. And the final chapter, Bodies and Minds, looks into health and well-being issues. One of the key issues raised here is the rise in mental health concerns, which has risen as the top health concern as identified in the survey displayed here. And the chapter also looks into recent rise in disability prevalence and the rise in chronic health conditions, and then goes on to explore the role of AI in medical technologies, the use of technologies to support people with disabilities and chronic health conditions. And it also looks into issues of care and the role of humans in caring and the role of education in building those skills for caring. So I've been rushing a little bit through those trends, is just to give you a flavor of the various topics that we are covering. Questions are around how education can contribute to human flourishing by enhancing mental health and addressing distress among students and staff, how it can discourage risky behavior online, help learners balance digital and offline lives, fostering inclusive attitudes, competency for caregiving, and also how it can make the most of advances in technology to support learners and educators. So this is kind of the bulk of the trends publications are focusing on exploring this trend data. And then each chapter finishes with a section on futures thinking tools and going beyond the trend data. Please, Rafal, stop me if I'm going too much over time. But I think this is probably the section that is very much of interest to this audience. So in the past, there has been experimentation with various tools to think about alternative futures beyond what we can see in the data. That has included representations, as you can see here, of how global trends may interact with one another. It has also included analysis of emerging signals that the future could look quite different from what past trends would suggest and from what our expectations might suggest. And that was actually developed in one of the previous editions together with the Strategic Foresight Unit. It also included, in previous reports, we had vignettes that presented fictional stories of how education policy and practice could significantly differ across alternative futures. And so that aimed to make it more tangible how this would look for different stakeholders. In the 2025 edition, we also have quite a few tools that can help readers engage with possible, plausible alternative futures. One key element of those tools is, so there are guidance and indications for readers to build their own tools, build their own scenarios and so on. But the book also offers examples of 3 scenarios for each of the chapters. And these scenarios follow the literature on archetypes of scenarios. And we developed 3 types of scenarios for each of the chapters. One is a continuation scenario that would assume that trends continue more or less in the future as they are developing now. The second one is a transformation scenario that assumes that some radical forces are significantly altering how things will look in the future. And the third type of scenario is what is called a collapse scenario, where basically we will result in a failed society due to some dramatic changes in the development of the trends. So here I have included the example scenarios from the first chapter of the book. So each scenario imagines what the world and what education systems might look like in 2040. On the left-hand side, you see global world developments, and on the right-hand side, you see potential developments in education. So in the continuation scenario, for example, we see a future in which armed conflict is persisting, where we see mounting pressures on public spending, with public spending being redirected to defense and security, directed away from social services, including education. So potentially education facing budget cuts, and also many students being directly or indirectly impacted by regional conflicts. Then in the future too, radical globalization, we imagine a future where measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as slowing trade internationally, have led to localized production and consumption patterns. And here education institutions could play a role in supporting communities to be self-sufficient while staying connected to global resources and global hubs. And then finally, we have the the collapse scenario, where we imagine that multiple climate tipping points are being crossed, with climate disasters feeding on conflict and sparking waves of migration. So obviously, as you all know, these futures are not predictions. They're aimed to inspire reflection, to guide action of our readers in the present, to help them seize opportunities, manage risk, shape their own futures. Such scenarios would obviously need adapting to the specific context in which they are being used. And the report, as I said, offers some guidance for readers, for stakeholders to co-construct their own scenarios. We then aim to make the scenarios as tangible and accessible as possible by imagining a range of stakeholders that are key in education systems. Here you can meet just some of them. They include policymakers, parents, teachers at various levels of education, students, trade union stakeholders, etc. And we then ask our readers to imagine what these futures could mean and feel like for those different stakeholders. And this is then paired with little speech bubbles where the stakeholders actually describe how the future looks for them. For example, here we imagined a university professor and imagined how she might respond to heightened defense and security concerns and to understand what these changes might mean in practice for a university. And in education, of course, there are many different levels and sectors of education who work with people of various ages who have very different concerns and needs. So there's also an invitation to consider implications for different levels and sectors, as well as for different areas of policy and practice. So here we leave it quite open to the readers and to the users of the report to make this useful to their specific contexts. We have some anecdotal feedback of how member countries and organizations have used this work, because we meet with our governing board where the country experts are represented twice a year. So we know it's been used for policy development, research and analysis, strategic planning, and stakeholder engagement activities. But the last more kind of in-depth evaluation of the project took place in 2020. So we're embarking this year on a new evaluation process where we're trying to get some more systematic insights into what is actually the use and the impact of this work. So for us, these are still open questions. Maybe you have some views and advice on how to go about these things, how to best evaluate the use and impact of this type of work. We're also still looking at various ways to best present the trends, the scenarios, and the thinking tools. Even presenting today, I know how hard it is to cover such a breadth of different topics without getting lost. So how do you keep it focused on what's most relevant for various audiences? And then, as I said, we're trying to go further into really understanding what is specific about strategic foresight in education. What can education systems learn from other sectors, and what can other sectors perhaps learn from education? So with this, thank you so much for listening, and I really look forward to the discussion.